Good evening, everybody. Thanks for making it out on a cold day. Hopefully everybody's staying warm. So I'm Sean. I'm one of the co-organizers of PyData Ann Arbor. There's also Ben Zaitlin, who's in the back there. Rose Putler, our usual host, is not here today, but she's one of our co-organizers as well. I'd like to acknowledge some of our sponsors. So we'd like to thank NumFocus for sponsoring this meetup, TD Ameritrade, which is my employer here, for sponsoring this meetup space, and also to Midas at the University of Michigan for sponsoring the delicious food that you're consuming. So if you see any one of these people across time, please do thank them. A couple important points: emergency exits. In case of emergency, there's an exit right here, and there's a staircase right outside the doors that you came in through. Provide feedback at any time to either any one of the co-organizers. You can also tweet at us at PyData Ann Arbor, or you can send us an email at PyDataAnnArbor@gmail.com. And just remember that we're in a borrowed space, so please do clean up after yourselves. There are garbage cans right next to where the food is. Also for Q&A, so unless it's a quick question, please hold it until the end. Also, please try to phrase your question in the form of a question, and try to keep the questions to 30 seconds or less, and avoid long statements or monologues. There will be time for open questions at the end, and also time for you to even come up and engage with our speaker as well. I'd like to read our PyData Code of Conduct. So PyData is dedicated to providing a harassment-free meeting experience for everyone, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, religion, or experience. We do not tolerate harassment of meeting participants in any form. All communication should be appropriate for a professional audience, including people of many different backgrounds and levels of experience. Sexual language and imagery is not appropriate for any of our meetup events. Be kind to others, do not insult or put down other attendees. Behave professionally. Remember that harassment and sexist, racist, or exclusionary jokes are not appropriate for PyData. Attendees violating these rules may be asked to leave the meetup at the sole discretion of the meetup organizers. But overall, thank you for making this a welcoming environment for everybody. A quick icebreaker, since I see a lot of new faces, is thanks to our speaker for recommending this, is turn to somebody either on your left or the right that you've not met before, or in front of you or behind you. Introduce yourselves and tell them what you'd like to do, what activity you'd like to do in the wintertime when there's snow on the ground. So we'll take maybe 2 minutes to quickly introduce yourself and tell them. So hopefully everybody has met somebody new this time. A couple of things. This month in data science, there is a PyData Los Angeles conference coming up December 3 to 5, as well as PyData Austin, which is happening in December 7 to 8. I think these are the remaining US PyData conferences that are happening this year, but do check out the PyData website as well at pydata.org for other future events. We were just at one last week in New York. Another thing too is I know that there's a lot of people that ask us how you might be able to support the PyData community. So right now, I guess from November 11th to 28th is Pi Giving. So if you feel so inclined and are feeling generous, please do support and donate money to the PyData organization or NumFocus organization. This will help fund a lot of not only our local meetup, but as well as many meetups across the world. And you can go to numfocus.org/donate to PyGiving. And also next month's speaker is Elizabeth Wicks, and she'll be talking about what happens when your data aren't numbers. So in the case of very messy, dirty data where you have to clean it up, that aren't numbers. So come out for that. That's on December 4th, also Wednesday. I wanted to open it up for any community announcements that anybody might have, whether you have job postings where you're looking for a job. Feel free to raise your hand and tell us your name. Yes?
Yeah, so I'm Albert. I work at Clink right here in Ann Arbor, where we do conversational AI. And right now we are hiring AI trainers, so if you're interested in training other people to build conversational AI applications, come talk to me afterwards.
Great. Other folks? Yes.
I'm Charlie Close. I'm just a reminder for anyone who needs one. Tomorrow, Midas is doing their annual symposium. It's at Rackham Hall, just a couple blocks from here. And I went once before. It was a lot of fun, a lot of really interesting talks. And if anyone has time to do that tomorrow, I'd welcome encourage you to go.
And it's the next 2 days, I think, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They have
Thursday,
symposium.
yeah, I think so.
Anybody else? Okay, great. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker. So we have Reshama Shaikh, who is coming from New York City to visit us today. Reshama has a statistics background, but she also has skills in Python, R, and SAS. She is an organizer of Meetup group, so the New York City Women in Machine Learning and Data Science, and also the New York City PyLadies group. Recently, she was also organizing the Scikit-learn sprints in the Bay Area. And so let's welcome Reshama as our speaker today.
Okay. So to introduce myself again, my name is Reshama Shaikh, and my talk today is about community building, calling it the good and the messy part of it. As Sean introduced me, I'm an independent statistician and data scientist. I started off after finishing college. My first job was at Educational Testing Service. That's the company that designs all these SATs and all that. I worked on the SAT subject test. And after that, I got into the pharmaceutical industry, and I worked there for over 10 years on clinical trials. And during that time, I started my MBA, and that's where I was introduced to data science. Back in 2012, it was called, the first course I took was data mining, which is now called data science. I've been organizing for the New York chapter of Women in Machine Learning and Data Science for 5 years now. It was a second chapter of Women in Machine Learning and Data Science, and I've been an organizer for PyLadies for 2 years. I'm also a board member for Big Apple Pie, and that is the organization that puts on the annual Pi Gotham conference in New York City. And I recently became a board member of Women in Analytics, which has a great conference over in Ohio, which I hear is a rival football city too. So I won't talk but it's a great conference. All right. I want to, I want to thank, as an organizer, I know, how much time goes into organizing these events and arranging for me to come here, and I really want to thank everybody who has contributed to this: PyData, NumFocus, TD Ameritrade, Sean for inviting me, and Michigan Data Science Institute for the food. I also, I just want to say, how Sean and I connected. Sean, I was on the Data Frame podcast, and so was Sean. And we ended up talking on Twitter, and that's how we became connected. So thank you for listening to my podcast, and for organizing and inviting me over. And also thanks to everybody for coming out here, especially since I know you just recently had snow much earlier than you expected. So the theme of this talk is going to be about, talking about community, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, open source, and this is going to be like the broad strokes of this conversation. I'm going to begin with the gender imbalance in tech. It's pretty skewed, as you may have heard. And so I put together this data for I did a presentation earlier this year for a major financial company in New York because I was trying to get sponsorship for these open source sprints that I was organizing. And so I went in and I picked some key information, and you can see, I compared tech to law school and med school, and we can see like where that drop is in tech. This data is for the United States only, partly because that's where I could find data for. And I used the most recent available statistics for each category. So for instance, med school, law school had recent publications for 2017 and wherever I could find the data. But even if the data was a few years old, it's actually quite consistent because there were categories where I could find data for 3 years and there wasn't, a big jump. I was not successful in getting sponsorship for that for that sprint. And so I was like, what can I do next time? And so they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so I put together a visualization. The first visualization I put together, I just had a rough one. I put it on Twitter, and it really resonated with people. And I received some feedback for it, and I made it into a different kind of visualization here. And we can see here, like med school and law school, actually it's 50% more women are enrolled, and these are graduate programs. And you can see the steep decline once it hits tech, machine learning, and then all the subsets after that, whether it's open source contributions to R or Python, which are both major data science languages, and finally to scikit-learn. It's very low. So create this visualization. So some of the topics that I'm going to cover in this summary, which are related to diversity in tech, are the Discover Cookbook, which is a project by NumFocus that I worked on. NumFocus, actually I'll get into it later, the Code of Conduct, workshops, deep learning sprint notes. Anybody here done the Fast AI deep learning course online? Yeah, okay, great, because I actually put together some notes for it. I don't know, you may or not have seen them. And open source sprints, I'll talk about them, and then the 2 meetup groups that we've mentioned previously. Okay, and so for each of these points, I'm sort of going to touch on, what it is, why it's relevant, some links to the resources. If you want to look at them, I can make these slides available. If you want to research this further or get involved further, there are suggestions on how to do that. And where applicable, this is where the title of the talk comes from. The good and the messy is some of the challenges where applicable. So the Discover Cookbook. The Discover Cookbook is a project by NumFocus. So NumFocus started this committee called DISC, which is called Diversity in Scientific Computing to Increase Diversity. And it began in the spring of 2017, so it's about 2.5 years old. And so I was on the committee for 2 years. My term ended in the spring of 2019. And during that time, I worked on a few projects. And one of the projects I worked on was this Discover Cookbook. And in November of 2019, so about 2 years ago, we had a DISCON conference, which I was also involved in. And so we brought new people to become involved. And so new people have taken over the project. And the current contributors are Leonie Milk, Madikin Monk, and Anna Rubalcaba, and I believe Madikin actually spoke here, right? So for those of you who were here for that talk, she is now working on that. The goal of this Discover Cookbook is we know that diversity, we can improve diversity, and it's a resource for event organizers, whether it's meetups or conferences, to make them more diverse and inclusive. Okay, and so some of the examples of the practices and the suggestions that are in this cookbook, and the link was on the previous slide if you want to explore it more fully, is getting diversity in speakers at conferences and talks, and also not just speakers but people who are on the organizing committee for these events. The Code of Conduct, I have to say I got some goosebumps when Sean was reading the Code of Conduct because I was actually on the committee that worked on that, and I learned a lot from that whole experience. I've definitely brought what I've learned to my meetup groups. Just some other examples that make events more inclusive and accessible to people are having nursing rooms for mothers and childcare, and also like access to refrigerator to store milk. Dietary restrictions, which I see we're doing here, mobility access, sign language interpreters, photography, pronouns. Other examples are, I noticed on Twitter somebody had posted something about how it was difficult for him to see presentations because of color blindness, so making that accessible. And also just other things, for instance, if people are wearing really strong perfumes or colognes, it can trigger asthma. So there's a lot. These practices to make events more accessible and inclusive, they span a wide range of options. So there's a lot of options, and they're broken down into high impact, low effort, and high impact, high effort, or things, and something that's really like easy to do, for instance, is pronouns. Not all the recommendations in this cookbook are required, but they're suggestions, and the goal is to really implement as much as possible. Some things that could be a bit more that can have a strong impact are gender-neutral bathrooms and nursing rooms. And something that's, for instance, high impact, high effort is something like making childcare available. It's an extra cost, but it can also bring more people to an event. And again, not all the suggestions there are required by any means, but there are some options and something to consider over time to sort of move to that area. There are ways. I wanted to make this actionable so people could sort of see what we've done, and what options are available, and how much you want to be aware. So, beginning it just being aware that this is available is very helpful. The other thing to do is to reference it, and this could also be like an event at work, or this is sort of focus on data science, but really whatever, if you're involved in a community group, whether it's your homeowners association or your co-op or a place of worship, or any community groups that you're involved in, a lot of these things that I'm going to discuss here are actually applicable to all of that. It's not really restricted to the data science community. So to share it with everybody. There are ways to contribute to the cookbook. It's a GitHub repository. So the usual, whatever with GitHub repositories, you can open an issue, you can give feedback, you can star the repo just to bring more traffic to it. You can also submit a PR if you have a suggestion to it. So. In addition to that, NumFocus for the DISC committee, there's a mailing list, and so you can keep sort of just up to speed on what they're up to and what progress they're making on their projects. And so the DISC committee is a subcommittee of NumFocus, so you can also sign up for the NumFocus newsletter. So I was a DISC committee member for 2 years, and I wrote a blog about the projects that I worked on. And so if at any point you want to become involved in the DISC committee, they have steering committee members, like chair of committees, and then also committee members. And there are different ways to be involved. So there's more information on my blog here. The code of conduct. So a great example is NumFocus's code of conduct, which I learned a lot from. The great thing about having codes of conduct at any events is that they promote professionalism and civility and this very welcoming space. And so there's a short version, and then there's a really long version so people can read the shorter version. And there's also information there about the reporting procedure. And so how people can participate in it is the first thing that I say for anything is just being aware that it exists. That's always very helpful. And so, there was a time when I would, as a Meetup organizer, I would promote conferences from other organizations, and I realized that many of the conferences I was promoting actually didn't have a code of conduct. And I thought, oh wow, I'm actually on a committee for code of conduct, and I'm promoting conferences that don't have it. So now the first thing that I do before I sign up for a conference or I promote it is I say, do they have a code of conduct or do they not? If they don't, I say, if you don't have one, here's one that you can recommend using, and they can just give attribution to NumFocus. I personally prefer educating people over boycotting an event. So instead of saying, I'm not going to go to your conference because you don't have a code of conduct, I can say, I really think that this is going to be helpful, it's going to be more welcoming, and here's something that you can do to make it happen. And it's actually worked. I've reached out to 3 different conferences, and they have implemented the code of conduct, so that's doable. And finally, in addition to, of course, all of us following the codes of conduct, is reporting the violations. If you see something, say something. We can all contribute to making events more welcoming. So, I actually wrote a blog about codes of conduct, and they're great, right? But they're not a panacea. They don't solve all the problems. And these are some of the reasons why it doesn't solve everything. Is sometimes when I run events for my meetup group in New York, I will, at times, I have this, I call it a delayed reaction. So something happens at my meetup group, and I don't really process it in my head until I go home that night. I go to bed, I don't sleep, I don't fall asleep, and I'm like, oh, something's bothering you. And then I kind of think back about what happened. An example is that, for instance, I had one event where I had to tell multiple times to women to please stop speaking because other people are complaining that they're being disruptive. And then this woman was a bit inebriated, and I kind of felt uncomfortable, but I didn't actually say anything. And it took a while for me to process that. So while we have codes of conduct and we have, sort of methods on dealing with it, sometimes I don't recognize that there's a problem until later on. There's also a gray area where sometimes someone does something and it's not specifically spelled out in the code of conduct, but it can be disruptive to people or make them uncomfortable. For this particular event, I had emailed the woman and I gave her my feedback, and she apologized and and asked, I'm sorry, can I stay in the group? And the thing is, when I post an event on Meetup, we have the code of conduct stated. When we send a reminder email, we have the code of conduct as a reminder. At the beginning of our event, we also talk about the code of conduct. So when somebody asks for, oh, can you just give me a warning, it's understandable, and I think warnings are important, but it's also like it disrupted the event. And if every time there's one little thing that happens at an event, it can be disruptive. There's always some disruption at an event. And I understand, people want warnings, but it can also be problematic. So there's the other thing about reporting violations and managing violations. We talk about it, but there's not a whole lot of discussion out there on how people manage. There's not a lot of transparent, open discussion on what exactly are some of these violations and how are people handling them and how can other people learn from them. And I think that that's going to be the next step in codes of it's nice to have a code of conduct, but what's next? There's codes of conduct 2.0 coming up. There is there's some training by a company called Arbor Technology, and I first see other companies sort of offering this training on how to deal with situations related to violations or certain behaviors at events. So the next topic that I'm going to talk about, still in the same theme, are open source Git workshops. In my opinion, I say Git is so important to open source, data science, accessibility. It's what driving is in the suburbs, right? If you live in the suburbs and you don't have a car, it's really difficult to get around. And if you're in data science and you don't really know Git very well, it takes longer to clone the repo each time. It takes longer to make changes. It makes contributing to open source not really possible. It makes, there's the free GitHub blog hosting that can be used as a website, but not for people who don't know Git. It's also for sharing code. That's accessible for people who want to share what projects they're working on, to share with the community, but also, to create a portfolio for looking for jobs. In my experience, it's not something that traditional university programs have really prioritized. I've been, even as my experience, it's like you should know Git, but it's important, but it's not so important that we're going to teach you. What I've done in New York, it actually. It started, I had gone to a meetup and somebody asked me, an organizer of the meetup asked me, this is before I had done any speaking ever, and said, when are you going to do a talk? And I was like, I don't know. And he's like, well, what are you going to talk about? I'm like, I don't know. I could talk about Git, because at the time I had been working at a boot camp and I would give the Git lectures. And so that is when I put together a talk for a meetup group. And I gave multiple talks, and I updated the curriculum each time. So that's sort of how the Git workshop started. And so I've given over 24 free Git workshops over the past 2 years in New York City. And the demand is there. People want to know Git. Probably I could give a Git workshop every month and have at least 24 or more people at the Git workshop. So my curriculum is available on GitHub. It's openly available, so you're welcome to use it. You're welcome to use it to give workshops and share with other people. The approach is, it's a bottom-up approach. I actually got this idea from Fast AI, where Jeremy Howard just goes in and teaches it and says, worry about the details later. And so for Git, I go through all the steps, because there are other tutorials out there that discuss things like branches, but this sort of teaches you how to use it. And I created these workflows, which are step-by-step. So it's each step, what I do when I teach it is I go through 3 steps and I say, okay, now you do it. Then I usually try to have 1 TA for every 5 to 10 students. And we go through the step, and there's different workflows for creating a repo, cloning a repo, pushing changes to it, and with branches. And this is an example on what cloning means and such. And so, again, like, here's something actionable. How can you participate? You can use the curriculum. You can tell other people about it. You could give a Git workshop at work or at a Meetup group. You can also contribute to it, like submit a PR. The next workflow that needs to be added is one for undoing changes. So that's sort of the next step. Yeah, and so the challenge with as I stated before, with the Git workshops is the demand is high up there, and so if you know Git, feel free to give Git workshops, and if you don't, feel free to use this reference. The next thing, which is a short, is the Fast AI Deep Learning Notes. So I know a couple of people here raised their hands saying that they've done the Fast AI Deep Learning course. So this is out of USF. Jeremy Howard he teaches this course and he records it, and so it's streamed, and people, really like thousands of people around the world, have taken this deep learning course. And so I created these notes, and you can see they've, in terms of stars and the traffic, it's just that the notes have been helpful to people. And so this is one other way to contribute to open source, is to share your work on GitHub and such. And so, and it's also like writing blogs too. And as I'm sharing the good and the messy of all of this, the challenge with that is maintenance. And also, one thing that I didn't expect they were sort of my notes, which I made public. I was not prepared for people opening up GitHub issues and asking me questions, and I was like, oh, okay, that means now I have to maintain it too. So it's something to keep in mind when you put something out there. Occasionally people submit PRs, which is a lot easier because you can review it and accept it, but with questions or other things it requires, sometimes it can require, yeah? PR. Pull request. Pull request on GitHub, which means you can change some code and submit that code, and it gets approved by the owners and can get incorporated into the current code base. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about, still in the theme of open source, is scikit-learn Sprint. So how many people who use scikit-learn? Great. Most of you know, but just in case you don't, scikit-learn is the machine learning library for Python. And this is taken from that visualization earlier on, but the participation rates by women open source are really low. It's like 11%. You get even lower for Python at 2%, and then we go to scikit-learn, and it's 0 to 1%. And so as an organizer for women in machine learning and data science, and also one of the benefits of living in a city where one of the co-maintainers of scikit-learn also lives is that we can organize scikit-learn sprints. And what is a sprint? I actually didn't know what that word was when when Andreas suggested it, I sort of thought of it as a hackathon, but it's an all-day event, which we typically have on a Saturday, to work on issues on GitHub library. And so because this is for beginners, it is, we work on labeled, quote, easy issues. We're not adding like a massive feature to it. We're making documentation changes, small changes. So the sprint started in March of 2017, was the first time the sprint was run. And then the next year, the sprint was organized in 2018. And so the goal of these sprints is actually to get more people involved in contributing to open source. So in 2018 was the first time after the sprint where I followed up with the participants who came to the sprint on their pull requests that they submitted. What happened with that was actually most people didn't respond. They didn't follow up on their work. And so for 2019, what I decided to do was I wanted to, because sometimes meetups can be, they're very like low-key, sort of, just very flexible events. But the sprints require something a little bit more from the participants, and they also require the work from the organizers because it's an all-day event. So I instituted this application process so people would know, first of all, to make sure that people have some level of Python and scikit-learn knowledge, because if people don't know any Python, then they don't really benefit from attending the sprint. The second thing is just to let them know that there's follow-up work required, and hopefully, not that every single person who participates in the sprint, but hopefully if the majority of them follow up on their work, that's helpful. And also to let them know the process, like it can take a month to have a PR, even for a simple document change merged in. There's a lot of back and forth from the reviewer. They suggest this, you try running the tests. Maybe it doesn't pass all the tests, so there's a lot of back and forth. And so it was instituted for the first time for the sprint in Nairobi, and I'll get back to that in a minute, but actually every PR that was submitted, every request that people worked on at the Nairobi sprint was completed by the participants, which is really, really remarkable and a great accomplishment. I also want to talk a little bit about Nairobi. So scikit-learn has a history of sprints where in the past it's been with the contributors, very advanced. Oftentimes they have them at major conferences like SciPy and such. So the sprints are usually in the US and Western Europe, and so I decided to organize a sprint for Nairobi because I looked at the data for women in machine learning and data science, and we have a chapter in Nairobi, and it was the fourth largest chapter with over 2,000 members. And I thought, well, we're having one in New York. Again, the plan for San Francisco was already in the works. The third largest is Paris, which was already in the works also. And I thought, well, why not Nairobi? And so it's a great story. It's a long story, and I can tell it later if we have time. But flew a contributor from Berlin to Nairobi and ran a scikit sprint, and it was great. So I mentioned the reason New York has had 3 sprints in a row is because the co-maintainer lives in New York. So it's run by one of the contributors. In 2020, one of the contributors lives in Berlin, and so the Berlin chapter of Women in Machine Learning and Data Science is also organizing a sprint. There can be sprints outside of where a contributor lives. It's just that it requires funding for the contributor to travel there. And it hasn't been entirely easy getting funding from companies to cover that travel and to fund the sprints. And so some of the other challenges is, so if the goal is to get long-term contributors, it's going to take a while to make that dent, right, when people are coming in as beginners and building up that experience. There's also, I mentioned the funding. Getting weekend space isn't also easy either. There are, very few companies that have the weekend space available. In New York, there's also the issue of, if it's summer or winter, the extra heating or air conditioning, there's extra costs associated because they turn it off on the weekends. It's whether if there are contributors that are available and interested in traveling. And time intense, following up on PRs takes time, right? It took a lot of my time to do the 2018 and finding sort of help for people to follow up on PRs. It's important. It's important to go through the whole process. It's a great learning process, but it takes time to manage it. And so this is just a photo of the Scikit-Learn sprint. This is Adrien here, who's a contributor that lives in Berlin, and he flew down. And this is our chapter in Nairobi. And this is just an example of our website where we have the sprints. And so some other possibilities for Scikit-Learn, many of you work for companies, is that, so in New York, Two Sigma is a financial company. They organized a company sprint last year where, because they have developers, and this is actually a way to make a dent in open source with experienced contributors, where they had 20 to 30 developers at the company do a one-day in-house sprint during the weekday. And Two Sigma organized that. We have contributors in New York who facilitated that event. Another option for Scikit-Learn is Columbia University has a Scikit-Learn lab where developers with machine learning experience can go, and they're looking for people who can commit to, obviously sprints are one day, but 1, 3, or 6 months. So that's an option. And so another way that this could look is in Paris. They often have a developer sprint because the Scikit-Learn library was developed in Paris. So there's a good handful of core developers that live in Paris. And so they will often have developer sprints there, and they'll invite some members of the community to participate in the sprint, and they can mentor the new contributors to it. And these are links for the sprint. I've also done an impact report, which shows, how many PRs were submitted, how many people attended, what they learned from it, what didn't work well, what we could do better. And so a lot of those, what could be done better, were implemented in future sprints. And so next, I've mentioned women in machine learning and data science. So finally officially going to introduce it. The goal of Women in Machine Learning and Data Science is to build a welcoming and supportive community for women. And we are on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. Our acronym is WiMLDS. It was founded 6 years ago, so it's 6 years old. We now have 80 chapters around the world in 35 different countries with over 43,000 members. It's just booming. It's been very popular. And to run those community groups, there's over 150 organizers. And I'd like to point out that in our community, it doesn't just include the members, it doesn't just include the organizers, but it also includes, our sponsors and people who support us on social media. It really is, it's a wide community that makes it happen. And this is the map for it. The great thing about this is we have a year ago, so we actually doubled in size in a year. Last year we had 39 chapters, 40 at this time of the year, and now we have exactly double, 78. We have about 7 or 8 chapters in the Middle East. A year ago, there was just no presence in the Middle East, but we have a chapter in Casablanca. Algeria, it just needs to be, the paperwork needs to be done. We have one in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, 2 in Turkey, 1 in Cairo, 1 in Israel. And also India is booming. We have a dozen chapters in India. It's just, all these towns. I was born in India, and we receive requests from cities that I have to Google. I'm like, where is this city? But yeah, it's been very popular. And also we have, a really commendable presence in sub-Saharan Africa too. So. And so what we do is we have speaker events that don't exclusively feature women, but we focus on women. We have panel discussions that we require that at least, if we're going to have a panel discussion, at least half of them are women. And so some of the events that we do is we give workshops in Python, R, TensorFlow, probability. We've done D3 before. Open source sprints, career workshops, just coffee, networking sessions. and hackathons, and you know, a lot of other co-promotes with other meetup groups and a lot of other events. So one of the advantages of being a data science is I wondered, with all of these meetup groups and all of these events, I was like, what kind of events do we do? And so I gave you that list first, but what I did was I actually had someone help me. She actually extracted all the titles of over 500 events that our meetup groups had organized over the last 5 years. And so I did an NLP analysis of that. And I calibrated like what number of topics to pick. 10 was a good topic. And so one of them is contribute to open source, which stood out, but these are the other topics. So you can see there's Pittsburgh, there's bingo is popular, Portland, there's deep learning. We see Python show up a lot. We don't see R show up a lot here, and that's probably because the R community has their own, you know, they're a pretty vibrant community. There's a lot of kickoffs. For every time a new chapter is started, there's a kickoff event for that. TensorFlow is big. We see PyTorch is over there. Deep learning has gotten bigger. There's some drinking going on here on Wednesdays. Yeah, so it was fun and it was informative to see what sort of events all the chapters were organizing. And so now I'll just talk about the New York City chapter, which is where I live and where I have organized for the past 5 years. We now have over 4,000 members. We've got 4 active organizers, and we do about 1 to 2 events per month. That's our meetup group. It's if you want to follow it, we also share a newsletter, but we just share conferences and information and resources also. So even if you don't live in New York, there's information that's valuable and available. So our culture in New York City, you know, there are some tech groups that, women in tech groups that restrict membership where maybe they don't really, sometimes they officially restrict it to just women and non-binary. In New York City, we've always welcomed men. We wanted to be inclusive, and so some of the challenges that we have faced in this is that sometimes, even when we have 90% of the attendees are women, we find that like sometimes men do more of the speaking. We've had some challenges where our events are so popular that we have the ratio. We have a lot. It's great that the events are good. We have a lot of men attending, and so then because space is restricted, our members complain, well, if this is a women's group, why can't I get to the event? And so these are just the challenges that we face as a meetup group. And one of the things is we've started saying, let women ask the questions first, and maybe that could help. But we haven't found an easy solution. It's something that we have an organizer Slack, and we have these discussions. And really, the truth is that different regions of the world face different problems. It's different in the Middle East and in India and in Africa and even in Southern Europe versus sort of the challenges that we face in the U.S. So as a community organizer, there are things that work really well for us, and then there are things that don't work so well. So we've been working with O'Reilly Media. If you know O'Reilly, they put on the Strata conferences, they put on the AI conference, they put on OSCON, okay? And so, they're really great at recruiting women speaking, having diversity scholarships. MLConf has a commitment to have 50% speakers be women. We have relationships where we share information and they can recruit speakers. I'm going to skip over that. Hang on just a minute. I'm just going to skip over some stuff because I want to make sure I cover the other things. We have a job board on our website, and so you're welcome to look. If you're looking for a job, you can look on the website. If your company wants to post a job, you can post on the website. It's free. Because we have such a large community of over 40,000 members, if you're hiring, it's a way to reach out to a whole pipeline of students and current professionals for work. These are our social media. Pretty much WiMLDS everywhere on social media is how you can find us. I do want to talk just about, in general, about diversity initiatives. And so one of them is measuring inclusion. There's not always an easy way to measure inclusion. We can look at it in terms of how many women are present at an event or at a company, but it's really difficult to quantify. There are all these women in tech organizations and initiatives. It's difficult to sort of measure the impact, exactly what is working and what is not. And the other thing that I would say is, after doing this for 5 years, I've really realized that, we say women in X, but really there's a lot of other dimensions of diversity that are important to consider. And URG stands for underrepresented groups, so it's people in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of disability, in terms of just people being parents or not parents, age, and it's important to consider all of those. And when they're all considered, then all those other groups will be supported. The other challenge I would say with community is that they're all volunteer run, and so they can go dormant. When the volunteer something happens in their life where they have to go on and do something else, they can go dormant. I looked up to see if there was a PyLadies Ann Arbor, and they have a Twitter handle. The last time they tweeted was May 2015, and I clicked on the Meetup group over there. And sorry, the group you have doesn't exist anymore. And so one of the things that's happened with PyLadies over the course of, they were founded in 2011. So that's 8 years since their founding. They've opened up close to 200 chapters. And I would estimate that only a third of them are actually active now, because groups open and close, and people go on with their life. And so the challenges with that, to keep community groups active, is there's really engaging with the organizers and the community that keeps them active. We do that in WiMLDS, but I can also tell you that it takes a lot of time and resources to do that. Because it requires more volunteer support at that level. And so some of the options that I have for that are to have, somebody asked this question, is to have like a lot of active organizers. So when one or two leave or have a life event happening, that it can continue on. Mentoring new organizers, really, it's sort of like creating that pipeline of people. And something else is, this all gets down to funding, is really getting paid staff to manage and provide global support for these organizations. At some point, volunteer staff can only go so far. And managing burnout. Burnout is real for volunteer organizing in any community, and I think it's important to manage that. I'm going to do a quick spiel on partnership on AI. It is a consortium that was started by tech giants, and they have 90 partner members, including a lot of NGOs. I bring it up because Women in Machine Learning and Data Science just became a partner organization. And so the goals for this organization is they want to develop and share best practices, advance public understanding. They really want to move AI development forward in a responsible way. And this is when they announced our AI. And so what you can do, really the key thing about this is they have these draft documents that are available. And the goal is to provide information on to companies and organizations. And they have one on the visa policy paper. They have about ML, which is best practices for transparency and machine learning. And they have other subcommittees. And these public documents are available for review and comment. So you don't have to be a partner organization. You don't have to be on a committee. They go through their cycles, and these documents are available. So you can sign up for their newsletter and also follow them on Twitter. And I will, I have more slides, but I think I will end here. I am on Twitter. My name is Reshama, so S is my last name initial. I have a website with a lot of blogs available, and my email is available here. And I guess now I can take questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody have any questions? Yep.
Yeah, so specifically on open source /Git, there are a lot of folks who, like, for example, they know the technical skills, right? They know how to do pull request and branching, but they aren't able to find a project that fits what they want to do, like a real open source project. So how do you help folks find projects that match their interests and kind of take the plunge and start doing open source development if they already have skills?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, so I'll repeat the question. The question was, there are people who have the Git skills, but they are not sure what project to begin contributing to. Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. To that, I would say use the one project is something that they actually use in their work. So, for instance, if you're doing data science machine learning, there is scikit-learn as an example, but also people use pandas, NumPy, and all of these other projects. So something that people use. And starting off with really, really simple fixes and working up to more complex fixes. That would be my suggestion. Yes?
Like, how do you find those problems? Like, are there like posts that say this is broken, someone fix it? Or?
Yes, so one thing that you could do is in your work, if you find problems, like sometimes, you might run a regression and, for instance, let's just say it's set up to do a binary problem, but you're submitting a multi-class, but they're not giving you an informative error, is to, if you find a situation like that, you could submit that fix. You could open the issue. A lot of these projects, and I know scikit-learn does that, is they're labeled. They're labeled easy. They're also labeled easy first issue. And if they're not, you can actually reach out to contributors and ask, and they're helpful that way.
Other questions?
Yes?
I had a few links in the presentation. Was one of them around open sourcing the open sprint model that you went through in the presentation?
Yes, so the question was, in my presentation, there were some links about open sourcing the open source sprint model. Yes, so I'm putting together documentation on how to organize an open source sprint. It's focused on WiMLDS, but it doesn't really have to be a WiMLDS. It's available to every organization. And so I'm about 50% through my documentation, but I intend to finish it. And I do want to do it because a lot of people reach out to me and ask questions, and so it's really, having a 1-hour conference call with people is not the most efficient use of my time. So I do want to write out the documentation so they have that information available, and then if there are other questions, then I can add to it or speak to them. Yes, it's coming.
Where will it be published?
It is on my blog. So actually there's one that's half written on it. Yeah, I don't know if I can figure out how to get to it, but yeah, I mean on this, I know how to get to it, but not on this machine. But yeah, that's the link to my blog. So it's actually the top post right now, but it's half written. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm really curious to know more about all these kind of chapters you have kind of popping up around the world. I guess I'm just curious to know if you know how they kind of learn about this and what kind of their motivations are for reaching out and starting a chapter, and then kind of what the ongoing relationship looks like with these chapters.
Okay, so I'll repeat the question. The question was for Women in Machine Learning Data Science. We have close to 80 chapters. How are people finding out about Women in Machine Learning Data Science? They're finding out through, I would say, two main things. Twitter is big. Twitter is very popular. We have close to 12,000 followers. The other one, which is the same podcast that Sean and I were on, after I was on the podcast Data Framed, which, I don't know, does anyone listen to Data Framed? Okay, so after that podcast, at the end of that podcast, I had a call to action, and I talked about women in machine learning data science. I said, if you want to open a new chapter, I think we just received like emails after emails from people all over the world, like Gaborone, New South Wales, Australia, all over Africa, Middle East, India too. And that's, I would say, Twitter and that podcast are the two main avenues. Yeah.
And what's do you have like an ongoing relationship with these organizers? Or they
Yes, yes. So we have a Slack channel for the organizers, and people ask questions, you know, about organizing events. We've put together a lot of resources for them. So we have, there's an introductory slide presentation. There's a starter kit on how to get started. WiMLDS will create the meetup. So we ask them just make sure they read our terms and agreements and agree to our code of conduct, and then we open up the meetup chapter for them to cover their dues. And if they have any questions about specific events, they ask on Slack. So we are a very like interactive community. I mentioned before that that engagement is very important, supporting the organizers and being in touch with them. Yes?
Yeah, first question is, you showed the data, right, beginning, so you said women is low
Yes.
in the technology, some AI, right, compared to the medical and the law, right? Do you know what is the fact? That's fact, what is the reasoning behind, right? So I don't know if you dig deeper into that, what happened, right, to the ratio is low. That's my first question. Second question.
You only get one question.
I hold
Okay.
for that.
Yeah, so I'll answer. The question was, what is the reason for the low rates of women in tech compared to in the medical profession and the legal profession? There's a lot of discussion out there. There's a lot of strong feelings about it. There's a lot of discussion about the culture in tech. There is, I mean, people talk about the culture in tech, I would say, and also the pipeline of the different fields where people are getting involved in terms of computer science. Computer science is a major field, and yet the number of female students in computer science is really, really low compared to like all these other fields, whether it's biology, whether it's statistics, and all of that. And so that entire that entire ecosystem has an impact on how many women down the line are in tech. And also the problem with tech is even for women that are in tech, women leave tech at a higher rate than any other field. So there's a leak also. But the discussion is culture.
I'll ask one final question.
Yes.
So you mentioned earlier about funding, especially sponsorship for events. What is the best way for not only our audience, but people viewing this at home too? What is the best way for them to contribute funds or to reach out maybe directly to you?
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways. If you want to support Scikit-Learn, they are an affiliated project of NumFocus, so you can donate directly to that. If there's a specific sprint in a region that you want to sponsor, you can reach out to info@WiMLDS.org. And there is, WiMLDS has a website, WiMLDS.org, that has a page also for donating.
Great. Well, hopefully this has given us a lot of food for thought, and let's thank Reshama again for a great talk.